you mold our lives. Father, we pray that you would be with Edward tonight as he leads the Bible study upstairs. We pray, Father, that you be with each teacher downstairs as they teach the little ones. Pray, Father, that we have open hearts and open minds and open ears as we hear taking another portion of thy word. Father, we just ask that you would go with us in our daily walks, that you would strengthen us in those areas that we need it the most, that you would forgive us when we fail to. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Good evening, everybody. I hope I'm on because I believe my mic was left on my belt, but I think they had it turned off back there, so the battery will be okay, I hope. It's good to see all of you. Hope all of you got through Christmas without gaining too much weight. I don't think I gained over 5 or 10 pounds. Barbara got back into the baking routine this year. Made a, red velvet cake, orange slice cake, and a coconut cake. Is that all? I sampled every one of them a time or two, Candace. Right here, man. Right here. Do what? You're on the spot now. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, come ahead. Be glad to have you. We'll eat as long as there's food, and if it runs out, we'll all quit. Barbara would like to have some of those must-goes, Miss Mary, to go. Several years ago, people were talking about what they had had for supper, or some meal anyway. And Miss Mary Phillips said, well, we had must-goes. And several of the folks looked at her and said, must-goes, what is that? She said, that's when you open the refrigerator door and say, this must go, this must go, this must go. So, must-goes. There's a lot of those around this time of the year, but I hope everybody did have a nice holiday season. We did, and appreciate all the cards and especially the cards with the pictures of the kids on them. Barbara and I have saved those over the years, and we got a whole passel of them. And it's amazing to watch those children grow through the years. But it reminds me we're getting older. Matthew 16 is the location of our study tonight, having concluded Matthew 15 last week. I want us to look at Matthew 16. This chapter is normally remembered because of Jesus' statement within it, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. But there's a lot of other interesting things in this particular chapter as well. I'd like for us to read, first of all, the first 4 verses. The chapter can be divided this way, I think, and it would help us in studying it. The first 4 verses have the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming to Jesus seeking a sign from heaven. And that particular section has some interesting thoughts in it. Then in verses 5 through 12, Jesus warns the disciples about leaven. Warns them about leaven. We'll talk about leaven some. And then Jesus discusses his identity and purpose with his disciples. That's in verses 13 through 20. And then in verses 21 through 28, Jesus prepares his disciples for what's ahead. He prepares his disciples for what's ahead. Let's look at those first 4 verses. The Pharisees also with the Sadducees came, and tempting desired him that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said unto them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, It will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O you hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky, but can you not discern the signs of the times? A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and there is no sign, shall no sign be given unto it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. I just happened to notice something in my edition. I talked the other day about the red letter edition the other Sunday evening. And as you read verse 4, that last statement, and he left them and departed, is in red letters in my edition of the Bible. And those are not the words of Jesus. And that's the very point that I was making. You know, you sometimes people get enamored with the red letters, but the editors and those that produced this particular copy of the Scriptures mistakenly put that in red. But I think that's a significant statement. He left them and departed. It would be sad for Jesus to just turn and walk away, wouldn't it? We have examples in the Scriptures of people turning and walking away from Him. The rich young ruler, for example, went away sorrowfully. He left Jesus, the one who could bring him salvation. But he went away, turned and walked away from Jesus. But here you have Jesus turning and walking away from some people. Because sometimes, you know, you're talking to someone and it's evident that you've done about all you can do. You've said about all you can say. And so it's better sometimes to turn and walk away, to stay out of trouble. Maybe tempers are flaring, getting too hot, and so on. It's better just to turn and walk away. But Jesus left them because He knew their hearts and knew, of course, that they had a problem with hypocrisy. And so He just turned and left them. Let's talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees for a moment. We've already discussed that, I think, or we have discussed them somewhat. The Pharisees were probably the largest sect among the Jews, and they considered themselves to be leaders of the blind. I didn't mention this when we talked about when Jesus said, leave them alone, and they're blind leaders of the blind. But the Pharisees describe themselves sometimes as leaders of the blind. That is, everybody else is ignorant, and we're enlightened. So we will inform the masses. We will bring the light to them. We will lead them because we're blessed with a superior knowledge. They sort of felt themselves to be among the spiritually elite. And they were legalistic in their approach to religion. They would strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. They would try to remove a mote from someone's eye, a little tiny speck of sawdust, while they had a 2x4, 6, 8, 10, 12 maybe, in their own eye. And they were very strict. Their name meant the separated ones, which pretty well described them because they were spiritual elitists and thought themselves to be superior in many ways. They loved to do things to be seen and heard of men, whether it was prayer, doing alms deeds, whatever. And they, as I said, when Jesus said to them, they be blind leaders of the blind, that was probably really a strong indictment of them because they did think that they were the only ones qualified to lead others. The Sadducees have been described as the aristocrats. They boasted of having the high priest and many chief priests among them. They were extremely liberal and materialistic in outlook and in reference to life. And so they were polar opposites. I guess you could say, of the Pharisees. Pharisees believed in angels and spirits, and they believed in immortality. The Sadducees didn't believe in any of those things. So, what do you have here? You have some people who are Jewish, some men who are Jewish, but religiously they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. But now they come together in opposition to Jesus because he is a common enemy. And you see that happen many, many times. People who don't like each other and have a disdain for one another will join forces against a common enemy. I recall seeing and knowing of people who are, well, they wear the same name religiously, but they don't get along too well. I remember hearing one of the preachers on the local radio station years ago, and man, he was really taking some of his brethren and just hanging them out, you know. I mean, he was really giving them down the road. But when there was a public discussion about the matter of salvation, then he was right in there with all the rest of his cohorts. But enemies of the truth will unite in opposition to it. And that's seen that Jesus, the ultimate truth, who only did good and only spoke the truth, was opposed by both of these people, or these groups. You'll notice that if you go back to chapter 22, or go to chapter 22, we'll see another example of this when we get to that. But notice that they could discern the face of the sky. I don't know how many times I've heard Barbara say, because she heard her daddy say it, and how many times I have said it because I heard my daddy say it. Red clouds at night, sailors delight. Red clouds in the morning, sailors take warning. How many of you have heard that, or a very similar statement? All of us have, haven't we? Well, that goes all the way back to Jesus' day, because it was a common saying that it's going to be fair weather because the sky is red in the evening. And when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red. And they were, I guess you could say, adept at predicting the weather. I know there are those who laugh at some of the older people who use various things to predict weather and patterns in the weather and so on. But, you know, people have been observing maybe the weather for 70 or 80 years in a particular area, and they pretty well tell you. One other thing that I remember my dad saying, the sun set behind a bank of clouds tonight. It may snow before morning. And lots of times he was right. You know, I'm sure there were times that he wasn't correct on it. But even those guys on television don't hit it, and girls on TV don't hit it every time, do they? But he goes on to say, now, you can discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. What does he mean by that? The signs of the times. What time? What times? Is he saying the same thing that a lot of people say? I know Jesus is coming in the next little bit because of the signs of the times. You ever heard anybody say that? Lots of times I have. I've had people tell me that in the last few weeks even. The signs of the times in this passage, in my opinion, refers to the things that were going on right then. What were they? Well, Jesus had just gotten back from going among the Gentiles and working all kinds of miracles and teaching them. And up until this point in the book of Matthew, he has been going to the Jewish people, teaching and preaching to them, lost sheep of the house of Israel, and doing all kinds of miracles among them. And Matthew shows that Jesus is fulfilling or fulfilled during his earthly ministry. Matthew wrote after the fact so many of the Old Testament passages, one after another. And there was conclusive evidence already shaping and forming that Jesus, the Messiah, had come. And yet you have all these Sadducees and Pharisees who were saying, no, he's not him. There's no way he could be him. You know, he wasn't born in the right place. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And why, he's just a carpenter's son. He's got to be royalty. He had to be born in a royal family in order to be the Messiah. So they had this picture in their mind of who the Messiah would be, what he would be like, what he would do, not do, and all that. And they have not been able to grasp the obvious truth that Jesus is the Messiah. He said all the signs are there. There's going to be one more sign given you. That's going to be the sign of the prophet Jonah. And if you go back a couple of chapters and read some statements there, you will find that he embellishes it a little bit by pointing out that he is going to be in the earth like Jonah was in the belly of the whale or the great fish. And that was clearly a reference to the fact that he was going to die, he would be buried, and that he would be raised from the dead. He said, now that's going to be the grand climax of all the signs that you've already seen. And that's the only one I'm going to tell you about. He had supplied the evidence in great force and in so many different ways. And he was fulfilling before their very eyes the prophets that they supposedly admired, respected, and believed, one after another, after another, after another, and yet they weren't able to discern that. So there had to be something wrong with them. Now we learned with their approach. We learned in chapter 15 they were blinded by traditions. They valued their Jewish traditions more than they did what God actually said in His law. Paul was correct too when he said the Jews seek a sign. You know, when he wrote to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians 1:22, for the Jews seek after a sign, the Greeks after wisdom. Man, that was an accurate description of the Jews, wasn't it? Paul, of course, was one of them. And so he may have been among those who were seeking for a sign during this period of time, though we have no evidence that he ever met Jesus during Jesus' earthly ministry. We do know that he met him and saw him on the road to Damascus and was thus qualified to become an apostle. Notice that they were described as a wicked or evil and adulterous generation. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. Now, they were evil in that they were resisting what was good. They were wicked. In some translations, the word is evil. In the King James, it's wicked. Basically the same thought and idea. They were wicked because they were not righteous. The word adulterous here may very well refer not to physical adultery, though there may have been the commission of that sin too, but rather spiritual adultery. Because the children of Israel were described in this way in many, many Old Testament passages. Deuteronomy 32:5 is one such example. Isaiah uses that figure also to describe the children of Israel during his time in Isaiah 50, verse 1. Jeremiah used it several times. Ezekiel did. Hosea did. That particular thought was introduced many times in the Old Testament in reference to God's own people. He would accuse them, for example, of having gone after other lovers. He would talk about their turning aside from Him. And Hosea probably utilizes the figure as well as any of the writers. But they're all a powerful reminder that when God's people depart from Him and turn to another love, then they are guilty of spiritual adultery. Know you not that friendship with the world is enmity with God? James asked, and he labeled those people as adulterers. And he said, you know, that's a grievous sin against God. God wanted them to come back to Him and resume the relationship. So Jesus is using some strong terminology with which these people ought to have been familiar, because they did know something about the Old Testament Scriptures. The Old Testament was being fulfilled before their very eyes, and yet they were too blind to see it. They had other things on their minds, and they just were not ready to accept it. The sign to be given them, as we saw in Matthew 12, had already been described. But that sign of Jonah that we talked about a little earlier, but guess what happened? When that sign was given, guess who rejected it? These very same people. Jesus was raised from the dead, seen by, Paul said, above 500 witnesses at one time. And many other cases where He was seen after He'd been raised from the dead. And I don't know if you've thought that much about it or not, but the fact that we're here tonight is an evidence, in a sense, that Jesus was raised from the dead. They hired people to lie about it. They bribed the guards. These were the very people, if not the exact individuals, the same group of people that denied the resurrection had occurred. And so Jesus knew their hearts. And I think it's interesting that toward the last of this chapter, Jesus begins to prepare His disciples for the fact that He is going to be killed. And verse 21 says, "From that time forth began Jesus to show unto His disciples how that He must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests." Many of the chief priests were Sadducees. and scribes, many of the scribes were Pharisees, and be killed and be raised again the third day. So this request for a sign at the first of the chapter carries right on into the remainder of the chapter as well. Any comments about this particular section? All right. Let's look at verses 5 through 12. When his disciples were come to the other side, that would be the other side of the Sea of Galilee, they had forgotten to take bread. Boy, the disciples have a problem remembering the bread, don't they? Occasionally, the ones who are to prepare the Lord's Supper for Sunday morning services sometimes forget it, don't we? We've all probably done that at one time or the other and had to be reminded. We're very fortunate here. We have several people who will always try to see to it that that's covered. Those who get here early will check it and see, if it's in place. If it's not, somebody just fly in and do it. I've thought over the years that it would be good to have two families maybe do it, and one could remind the other. I remember Brother Ira North talking about the preparation of the Lord's Supper at Madison years ago, 3,000 people, and they would have maybe 4 or 5 families who would be assigned to do that. And he would say, oh, you just ought to hear those people when they're doing that. He said, just one of the greatest periods of fellowship you've ever seen and heard in your life. How they enjoy doing that together. Brother North was a great promoter and organizer. Somebody asked him one time how it had been that Madison had grown to the extent that it did. And he said, because of the people who are willing to work. They work together, get it done. And he said, I'm just a preacher, but we have a lot of very talented people, and that's really what it takes. But we sometimes might forget the bread and the fruit of the vine. But the disciples so many times are looking for bread to eat and with which to feed people. And lo and behold, you have just read about the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, and here they are again forgetting to take bread. That's sort of interesting to me. Then Jesus said unto them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we have taken no bread. That is, he's upset with us because we forgot the bread again. But when Jesus perceived, he said unto them, O you of little faith. Does that sound familiar? How many times has he said that to these same disciples? Repeats that over and over and over to them. Why reason you among yourselves? How many times has he asked them, why are you reasoning that way? By now you ought to know better. Because you have brought no bread. Do you not yet understand? Do you not yet understand? Haven't you come to understand these things? Neither remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? Neither the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many baskets you took up? How is it that you do not understand that I spoke it not to you concerning bread, that you should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? It seems to me that the problem with the Pharisees and Sadducees is still weighing on the Lord's mind. He's still thinking about that and recognizes the danger that they pose to his disciples. Should his disciples choose to follow them and become hypocritical as they were, that would be a huge problem. Well, he wasn't talking about literal bread. Wasn't talking about literal yeast that causes the bread to rise. But he was talking about the doctrine of the Pharisees, as seen in verse 12. Then understood they how that he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. So therein is found the solution. Leaven is an amazing thing. Several years ago, Barbara worked in food services over at the cafeteria at the elementary school when the girls were there. And she gained access to a great recipe for rolls. And man, I was delighted when she made those things. They would rise, they would be so fluffy, just pretty to look at and a whole lot better to eat. And when she would honor us with some of those, they were really, really good. But the phenomenon of putting yeast, just a small amount in dough, and man, watching it work, it's magic. It is really, really something. But Jesus tells us that leaven can be good or bad. He uses leaven to illustrate good things. The kingdom of heaven is like unto a woman that put yeast in her bread, like that. It rises, adds flavor. All of that. Or it can be bad. There are good influences, there are evil influences, aren't there? We need to be sure that we try to always be a good influence. The kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, Matthew 13, verse 33 says. But Paul on 2 occasions to the Corinthians and the Galatians said, a little leaven does what? Leavens the whole lump. He's talking about sin in those passages, false doctrine, things that are corrupt. He said that evil can spread and contaminate what's around it. And how many times do we see that? How many shootings were reported last night on the news, Christmas Eve? I know I heard at least 3 on Christmas Eve. Evil spreads, it grows like leaven. The old is to be purged out, 1 Corinthians 5, 7, and 8 says. And in Luke 12, verse 1, Jesus identifies what this leaven of the Pharisees, Sadducees is. It's their teaching. And Luke labels it as hypocrisy. Their hypocrisy. Sunday night we talked in the invitation about let love be without hypocrisy in Romans 12:9. That's what Jesus desires. He wants our pure and unadulterated service to Him without any sham, pretense, or hypocrisy. Well, our time is gone for tonight. We appreciate you being here, and hope all of you continue to have a good time with your family. The Partlows are here with Miss Ruby still, and I know she's enjoying that. It's good to see all of you here tonight. Hope you'll be back Sunday morning.